As we go through life, most of us try so hard to avoid the inevitable, fear. But there are those few brave souls that seek only fear, like those of you who clicked this video. For that, I thank you. But by the end, you may not thank me. So lock your doors, bar your windows, turn up the lights, and prepare for part 1 in the Darkness series, An Unseen Helper. Now relax. This won't hurt too much. I lay in my bed, staring up at the ceiling. A light touch on my wrist made me jump slightly. I looked to my right, where the touch was, and there was no one there. A soft voice spoke into my ear. The darkness is coming. You must stay alert. You must stay. I sat up, looking around frantically for the source of the voice, but it seemed to come from thin air. It may have just been my imagination, as I was under a lot of stress, but something inside of me knew better. I eventually drifted off to sleep, the memory of the disembodied whisper still running through my mind. Somehow, I awoke refreshed the next morning. I checked my phone on the table beside me and I saw I had a new voicemail. Checking it, it was my coworker.
Jack, it's Steve. You gotta come down here and see this.
I sighed. A message that vague was never a good thing. A short time later, longer thanks to rush hour traffic, I arrived at the small office. When I walked in, I saw Steve staring intently at his computer screen. Upon my arrival, he looked up and greeted me, and then motioned for me to come over to him.
Jack,
Said Steve.
something big just came up on the radar a few hours ago. It looks like the biggest one to hit us since '79.
Looking at the monitor, I suppressed a shudder as I found myself agreeing with him, despite desperately wanting this to be one big false alarm. What are we going to do about this? I asked, already anticipating the reply. Sure enough, Steve replied with,
We need to put out the alert. If it's as bad as I think it is, people are gonna die if we don't act immediately.
Again, I prayed it was a false alarm, despite the overwhelming evidence on the Doppler showing, if it happened, utter hell on earth. I went over to the window and looked out. Clear skies. I walked over to my desk and powered up my PC. I opened the weather forecast and it showed no activity. Normally I swear by the Doppler radar, but this just felt too odd for me to trust. It could possibly be a false alarm. But on the other hand, even the slightest inkling of a series of storms this severe had me agreeing with Steve. Make the call. While Steve called the mayor and the National Weather Service, I sat at my desk and pulled the Doppler up on my computer. It wasn't as sophisticated or advanced as the radar on Steve's machine, but it still could pack a few punches. As it loaded, all hope of a false alarm blew out the window. Once all the calls were made, an evacuation plan was put into effect. By noon, only 30 or so people remained in the town. The skies were still somehow clear, but now that I was outside, I took note that the sun seemed dimmer somehow. I chalked it up to my imagination, until another light touch on my wrist caused me to jump. You see it too? I glanced around frantically, hoping it was someone just messing with me, but to no avail. A tap on my shoulder made me jump again, and this time I let out a small yelp of fright. My head snapped in the direction that the tap had came from, and was met with the concerned face of Steve.
You okay, Jack? You look a little pale.
I very nearly told him of the light touches and disembodied whispers that had plagued me for the last few days, but decided against it. Steve was my best friend after all, but the idea of telling him, a skeptic, about that stuff at this point seemed foolish. I decided to lie. Just concerned about what's happening, that's all. This seemed to give Steve some relief, though he still looked troubled as he turned and walked away. I followed, moving over to the equipment we had set up to track any changes as they occurred, to where the director of the National Weather Service, Jim Wilkes, stood expectantly. When we met up, Jim spoke.
I sure hope for your sakes that something actually happens.
Steve and I exchanged worried looks at that statement. Jim continued.
I may as well tell you, an evacuation of this magnitude, nothing happening, is bound to get you into some serious hot water. Don't worry, I'd have done the same thing if I was in your shoes. But nothing happens, this town's gonna hang you high from the highest tree.
Following that, Jim made a choking face and then offered a sympathetic smile before turning back to the equipment. By 3 p.m., the sky was so clear and the occupation level dwindled down to about 12 people, Steve and myself included. I looked at the sky occasionally and saw that the sun seemed to grow darker each time. Finally, I folded and told Steve everything, even directing his attention to the seemingly darkening sun. I could tell from the look in his eyes that he was having trouble believing me, until he looked back up at the sky and the look of disbelief turned to one of utter shock. I followed his gaze when I noticed that the sun had darkened considerably, but that was eclipsed by the grasp of unseen hands on my shoulders and the voice, now more audible. "Within the hour," it said, and Steve looked at me and asked,
"Did you hear it too?"
I nodded with a blank look on my face.
"What does it mean?"
asked Steve with wide eyes. The realization hit me then when I realized that the sky was still clear because the clouds were invisible. They were bloody well invisible. I relayed this message to Steve, who now looked like he was apt to cry at any minute. We ran back into the office and checked the computers again, confirming what we feared and what the voice foretold. The storm would imminently strike within the hour. With a quick glance at each other, no words needed to be spoken as we turned and rushed to find Jim. When we found him, he was giving orders to pack up and move out, as his knowledge told him that it was a false alarm.
"Jim!"
Steve called as we slowed to his position. Jim looked for the sound of the voice, and when he saw it was Steve, his expression hardened and softened at the same time.
"I don't envy you right now,"
he began, but I cut him off. "Jim, we need to get out of here. The storm is due to strike within less than an hour." The expression on Jim's face was that of anger.
"Listen, Jack, this equipment here isn't showing anything of notability. There's nothing more for us to do other than pack up and wish you good luck."
I opened my mouth to protest, to explain about the quickly darkening sun and all that, but Jim raised his finger to silence me, then turned and walked towards his vehicle. I looked at Steve, exasperated and frightened. At the same moment, I saw him flinch and pull his hand away from nothing as if he had just received a shock. I braced for what would come next. Steve then said,
"Something just spoke to me, but I can't make heads or tails of what it said. It was something like, 'It's all downhill from here.' What does that mean?"
I racked my brain for an answer, and then it occurred to me. If the voice warned me, why can't it warn Steve too? Steve looked at me, desperation growing in his eyes. I raised my hand to silence him, as I was trying to solve the seemingly cryptic message. Then it came to me. "It's all downhill from here," I said quietly. "If this voice thing is trying to keep us safe, then it may be telling us to either go downhill or maybe get underground to protect ourselves."
"Yeah,"
agreed Steve.
"Maybe we could find a place with a basement and..."
Steve was cut off as the world suddenly went dark, then was illuminated by a brilliant white light. Without thinking, I grabbed Steve's hand and ran for our office, slamming and locking the door upon entering. 3 more short bursts of the white light appeared, followed by a low rumbling that slowly grew in volume. Things were silent following that, as we made our way into a small storage room at the back of the building to take shelter, another flash and a louder rumble occurred. The rumble rose until the floor beneath our feet began shaking, and just as I closed the door behind me, I had time to see the plate glass window in the front of the building implode. The room was dark as pitch. I stumbled over a cardboard box and fell, hitting my head on what was probably a chair. I could hear Steve stumbling about, and then a splintering sound filled the small room, louder than the rumble of thunder that preceded it. At this point, I pulled up my phone and turned on the flashlight, and saw Steve lying halfway through the wall, the upper half of his body leaning downward on a long concealed staircase that had been sealed off long before we took over the small office. Steve was muttering to himself as he tried to get up.
"Oh, stupid boxes! Feels like I broke my back!"
I moved over to him and helped him up, where he brushed himself off and took note of the downward staircase in front of him.
"This place wasn't supposed to have a basement. Maybe we could ride the storm out down there,"
said Steve, an optimistic glint in his eyes. I agreed, then took the lead down the stairs, Steve following close behind. When we reached the bottom, I surveyed my surroundings. There was what appeared to be at some point a fallout shelter equipped with rations and a rather large, but still old, generator with numerous propane tanks placed neatly beside the generator. Steve also noticed the generator, then said,
"One of us needs to go back up there and get the computer. We can keep an eye on things and still stay safe down here."
"Okay, but which one of us has to go get it?" There was a pause, and sensing Steve's reluctance, I volunteered. A few moments later, I was lugging the computer equipment down the narrow staircase, grumbling. I set the equipment on a table near the generator and stood back, catching my breath.
"Do you want me to take over, Jack?"
asked Steve. "Sure," I replied sarcastically. Steve gave me a look somewhere between irritation and remorse. He knew of my back injury years previous, and presumably felt bad for making me lug all that heavy equipment down those stairs in a storm. Years previous, I had been jumping on my trampoline on a fall day, all alone and loving it. I was about 13 at the time, and being left alone at home was still a novelty. I would have invited Steve over, but he had some sort of previous engagement, so I didn't press any further. I got bored after a while, and decided to go back inside and do something else. As I reached the edge of the trampoline, I had the idea to jump off and land on the grass, something I had done many times before without issue, so any thoughts of perhaps hurting myself were nowhere in my mind. When I landed, I lost my balance and fell full force onto my back, a loud snap clearly heard. I tried to get up, but the pain proved too intense, so I grabbed my cell phone. I had no minutes left, only texts, so I texted Steve, "Help! I've fallen and I can't get up." The only response I received was, the usual response when he didn't take me seriously or didn't understand. I then angrily text back, "I fell off the trampoline and can't get up. Call 911 or something." I got no replies for about 5 minutes, until a distant siren was heard. It swelled in volume, then ceased as it pulled up outside. 2 EMTs entered the back gate and helped me onto a stretcher, where I was then rushed to a nearby hospital. When I arrived, I saw my parents waiting. I was released later that day, wearing a back brace. I hadn't broken anything, thank God, but I had severely sprained my back, leading to now, many years later, filled with constant pain. Just as I finished mentally reminiscing, Steve finished setting up the computer. He walked over to the generator, where everything was plugged in, and started it up. It was a noisy thing, but it did the trick, as several lights turned on and the computer powered up. After following the necessary procedures to set it up, he opened the Doppler program, and after the radar loaded, the image we saw on screen wholly terrified us. It showed a massive storm system that had taken up residence. The system showed no signs of letting up for quite a long time. Steve and I exchanged a worried glance, then turned back to the computer screen. I woke up, cold and wet as usual. Steve lay near me, looking uncomfortable as he slept on. It was not the cold that had awoken me, but a light tap on the wrist, followed by the now familiar voice next to my ear. "The end is near." That voice snapped me out of my slumber. It had been weeks since either one of us had heard the voice, so it came as quite the shock to hear it. I shook Steve awake, who sat up looking rather bewildered. "The voice! It came again!" I said rather enthusiastically. Steve seemed to fully wake up as I spoke to him.
"What did it say?"
asked Steve. "The end is near," I replied.
"What's that supposed to mean? An end to the storm, maybe?"
I walked over to where the computer was set up and turned it on. I checked the radar. Still the same site that had beheld us for the last 5 weeks since the storm began, the system showing no further signs of vacating.
"What do you see?"
I debated on how to answer him, as it became clear what the voice truly meant. "Same thing," I replied in a broken tone of voice. I was at my wit's end, and saw that Steve seemed to be as well. His voice was working with emotion, and then he spoke.
"Is there anything you're not telling me?"
I sighed. "Do you really want to know?"
"Yeah, if it means maybe being able to figure out the situation here, Jack."
His reply finally made me snap. "Fine. What the voice said means that the end is near. Literally. The end meaning our end. Couldn't you have figured that out on your own?" My shouts reverberated off the concrete walls of the basement. Steve looked at me and then burst into tears of anger.
Don't shout at me! I'm not the one who started all of this, so quit blaming me!
As he shouted in reply, I walked up to him until we were nose to nose. I must have had a look of murder on my face, as Steve pushed me and I landed on my back, crying out as I did so. Ah! The madness that shrouded Steve's face evaporated the moment I cried out. Sanity was restored once again as he realized what he had done. He was at my side in a heartbeat. Get away from me! I shouted as Steve tried to help me up. Looking crestfallen and guilty, he backed off and retreated to the other side of the room. I didn't know what happened shortly after, as the pain was too much and I passed out. I awoke presumably several hours later to Steve gingerly approaching me, looking nervous.
Do you want some help?
He asked hesitantly. Please, I need to sit up.
Okay, easy does it.
I groaned in pain as Steve helped me sit up. Despite the great pain, I knew that nothing had been broken in the fall.
Jack, I'm so sorry.
I cut him off. It's fine. I'm the one who should apologize. I snapped at you for no good reason. This is all my own fault. Steve said nothing to that, looking as if he would cry at any moment. He turned and walked over to the other side of the room and slumped over against the wall. Steve ventured upstairs, leaving me behind in the basement. He was gone for a few minutes, and then I heard footsteps rapidly approaching.
It's not raining anymore. We should get out of here and go get help for you,
Steve excitedly said. I had done little except sleep for the last few days. I tried standing up and was met with no results. I looked at Steve with despair, to which he said,
I'll carry you if I have to.
I think I can walk. You don't have to. Just help me get to my feet, I replied, voice hoarse from lack of use. Steve lifted me to my feet, ignoring my grunts of pain. He supported me as best he could, but as I tried to take a step, my legs gave way, with no feeling whatsoever. Steve looked worried at this, but didn't hesitate as he lifted me over his shoulders and mounted the stairs. The stairs creaked loudly, and just as we reached the top, the staircase collapsed. Shit, I said as we looked back at the now empty hole where the stairs once stood, realizing how bad it could have been when we had been on the stairs if they gave way.
Don't look back,
grunted Steve as we walked through the remnants of the door back outside.